Cur Homo Artista, on the ease of the impossible. Catapults. In the course of these investigations, we seem to have reached a point at which it would be productive to take stock of the distance covered. It leads, pointedly put, from anecdotal steps to approach the planet of the practicing, to the emergence of the region we call habits, and then from the appearance of habits to the leaps into the supraordinary. This term does not refer to the average improbability of nature, the socio-historical specializations on the plateau of Mount Improbable, but rather to the above-average improbability that is reached as soon as individual people, whether alone or in the company of co-conspirators, begin to catapult themselves out of the habitus communities to which they initially and mostly belong. Once one has grasped the fatefulness of the abrupt and uncanny secession of the heightened from the inhabitants of the base camps, it becomes evident that cultural theory can only be meaningfully carried out as the description of catapults. Here we once again see the explicifying movement that we know drives and accompanies the progress of civilizations towards cognitive self-display. Explication breaks up what is found in confused disclosedness and augments the aggregate of the already discovered with further discoveries. In the process, the boundaries between the commonplace and the usual are shifted. People increasingly become the creators of self-performed miracles. As anyone would concede, nothing is more obviously natural than for humans to be entangled in habits. Nothing could be less obviously natural, however, than for individuals who, not infrequently, later act as pioneers in questions of world orientation, for their collectives to find themselves in a secession from habits. Precisely this is the movement towards the supraordinary that can be observed in the ancient birthplaces of philosophy, in Greece as well as in India and China. Cultural historians associate this process with such phenomena as urbanization and division of labour, which does little to elucidate the matter. What is genuinely thought-provoking is rather the question of how, in the course of this secession, the complex of acquired habits as such could become thematic, and the thought of supraordinary things powerful within individual humans. However one answers this question, one thing is clear. It is only in this separation that the human as an advanced civilization discovers itself as the animal that is split, mirrored, and placed beside itself, that cannot remain as it was. Difference within humans is now primed as difference between humans. It divides societies into classes of which the theorists of class society know nothing. The upper class comprises those who hear the imperative that catapults them out of their old life, and the other classes all those who have never heard or seen any trace of it, normally people who are quick to admire, and thus make it clear that higher efforts can exclusively be a matter of the admired, certainly not the admirers. This non-political division of classes initiates the history of the inner witness or observer. Swimming in the waters of habitus, discourses and language games is one thing. Getting out and watching one's fellow humans from the edge as they swim in the habitus pool is another. As soon as this difference develops a language of its own, to become a doctrine and life form, those based on the shore distance themselves from the swimmers. When, therefore, the ancient Indians discovered the observer or witness consciousness and equated it with Atman, the subjective world principle, they created routes of access to a surplus of attention, which simultaneously silences and mobilizes them. And when Heraclitus deems it impossible to step into the same river twice, this may be a passing reference to the irreversible stream of becoming, which is how the dictum is often read, in convenient analogy to everything flows. In reality, the opaque formula reminds us of a deeper irreversibility. Whoever steps out of the water can no longer return to the first way of swimming. With the emergence of consciousness from the habit nature of human behaviour, a boundary is reached that, once visible, must already be overstepped. One cannot discover the habits without adopting a certain distance from them. In other words, without getting into a duel that clarifies who dominates the ring. Not everyone wants to win this fight. Conservatives of all periods feign weakness in order to be overcome by habit, and then to be allowed to serve it after its victory as if it were invincible. Others, by contrast, are convinced that habits are foreign rulers under which no life can be lived. This is the position brought to light by Foucault among ancient authors in his late studies on self-concern. Quote-unquote, concern for oneself is the attitude of those who have encountered the greatest of all opponents within themselves, the two-headed daimon, which, as we saw, keeps humans in a state of possession. On one occasion as an impulse power, that is to say, a complex of affects that rise up in me, and on another as an inertial power, that is to say, a complex of habits that have sedimented themselves in me. The secularization of the psyche, discussed in the same context, consists of nothing other than the creation of a new handling art that turns possessions into manipulable dispositions. In this transition, the enchanters disenchant themselves and change into teachers. They are the provocateurs of the future, who build the catapults for shots into the supra-ordinary. The axial age affect, the humanity of two speeds. The discovery of both passions and habits forms the psychological counterpart to the long-known process termed the discovery of the mind by philosophers and philologists. Karl Jaspers summarized this complex with the somewhat mysterious title Axial Age, and named 5 places of breakthrough: China, India, Persia, Palestine, and Greece. These, he states, are the locations in which advanced civilizatory progress in intellectualization took place first of all, and with unforgettable long-range effects. In the period between 800 and 200 BC, people in those cultures took the step into the universal that we continue to this day in everything we do, with an authentically civilizatory intention. According to Jaspers, the first outlines of what would later be called reason and personality became visible during that time. Above all, however, it was from that point that the divide between the most heightened individuals and the many grew immeasurably. Jaspers writes, quote, "What the individual achieves is by no means passed on to all. The gap between the peaks of human potentiality and the crowd became exceptionally great at that time. Nonetheless, what the individual becomes indirectly changes all." End quote. By advancing their exercises on the tightrope of humanization, the extremists introduced the duty for everyone to pass a test in intermediate acrobatics to remain in the practice community of the humanized. The simple people obtain their certificate if they admit that merely watching makes them dizzy. In reality, the discovery of passions and habits cannot be separated from the discovery of opinions, for the same interruption that allows humans to step out of the river of emotions and habits also makes them attentive to the sphere of mental routines. This interruption, which signals the entrance of the observer, irreversibly creates new positions concerning the totality of facts, inside as well as outside. Stepping out of the river means abandoning the old security of the habitus and the inherited culture, and ceasing to be a growth of the first cultural community. Now the aim must be to found a new world from the shore with new inhabitants. For this reason, the axial age effect is not so much based on a sudden worldwide interest in increased intellectualization. It comes from the gigantic disturbance of habitus that followed the discovery, from the shore, of the inertias embodied in humans. The most important cause for this is the inner exhilaration triggered by the early cultures of writing. This was responsible for the overtaking of the habitus of the non-writers by the brains of the writers, just as the bodies of ascetics, athletes, and acrobats overtake the bodies of everyday humans. The velociferic power of writing practice, which entails additional exhilarating principles, makes the inertia of the old ethos sunk into the average bodies palpable. Where exhilarating practice asserts its effects, cultural evolution becomes divided. The result is a humanity of two speeds. It is this disturbance that forces the secession of an elite of learning and practicing parties from the old commonalities. It leads to the construction of a new heaven over the old earth, and a new koinon over the old communes. The koinon that must be conquered, that shared realm in which, since the Milesians, the stars, the Logos, and the Polis have supposedly testified to one and the same order, is much too sublime and remote from everyday institutions to be accessible to all. It is from this that the basic paradox of all universalisms develops. A common system for all is set up in which most can only participate in the mode of non-comprehension. The paradigm for this is the division, which has been dominant for 3,000 years and partially revised for barely 200, of humanity into its literate and non-literate factions. Virtually, after all, everyone could be able to write, but only few do actually write. And those few will unwaveringly believe they are writing for someone else. The same applies to all figures of logical, ethical, or medial socialism. Some might call the setting of the universalism trap the intellectual side of the entrance into a class society, though the distinguishing criterion, admittedly, no longer consists in the power of an armed lord over his unarmed servant. It lies rather in the self-arming of the practicing individuals against the inertias within themselves, through logic, gymnastics, music, and art in general. In this practice-cultural turn, the role models of axial age spirituality are constituted: the wise men, the illuminated, the athletes, the gymnosophists, the sacred and profane teachers. It is with figures of this type that the people of advanced civilizations would concern themselves in the subsequent millennia. Artists in the modern sense were not initially an issue. They would ensure that culture time became the time of intellectual role models. Getting to the other side. Philosophy as athletics. To continue the metaphor of stepping out of the river, humans who have accepted the task of explicating the inertia within them find themselves forced by the course of experience to switch to the other side of their self-findings no fewer than 3 times. By noting how passions are working within them, they understand that they must reach the other side of passion, so that they do not simply suffer from the passions, but rather become skilled at suffering. By noting to what extent they are controlled by habits, they immediately understand that it would be decisive to cross to the other side of habits, so that they are not simply possessed by them, but rather possess them. And by noting that their psyche is populated with confused notions, it occurs to them how desirable it would be to arrive at the other side of the tumult of notions, so that they are not simply visited by muddled thoughts, but develop logically stable ideas. Thought begins when the charade of associations ends, that is currently being described as a competition of quote-unquote memes for free capacities in the neocortex. This threefold change of sides forms the ethical program in all activities grouped together by Plato under the invented term philosophy. The word, quote-unquote philosophy, undoubtedly contains a hidden allusion to the 2 most important athletic virtues, which enjoyed almost universal popularity in the time of Plato's intervention. It refers firstly to the aristocratic attitude of philotomy, the love of time, that glorious prestige promise to victors in contests, and secondly, to philophony, the love of ponos, namely effort, burden, and strain. It is no coincidence that the patron saint of athletes was Hercules, the performer of the 12 deeds that were preserved in the collective memory as archetypes of ponoi for an entire epoch. Just as philosophers after Plato would later portray themselves as friends of wisdom, gymnasts and philosophers presented themselves long before them as friends of the toil that makes men into men, and as lovers of the long, hard labour placed between them and the victory by the gods. The Cynics, in particular, later claimed Hercules as their ancestor in order to underpin their thesis that they alone, the total ascetics among philosophers, were true athletes, while the sportsmen were no more than decadent musclemen chasing after ephemeral success, without any notion of solid virtue or cosmos-suited reason. The imperative, "You must change your life," thus resounded in ancient Europe from the 5th century BC onwards, not only from the countless statues that the Greeks, like people possessed by an unbridled pictorial compulsion, erected in temple precincts and squares, as if they wanted to augment the mortal polis dwellers with a population of statues, presumably to draw attention to the similarity between gods and victors. It comes even more from the new knowledge situation, or rather the altered attitude of the knowing to their tasks in life. Changing one's life now means breeding, through inner activations, a practice subject that will eventually be superior to its life of passions, habitus, and notions. This means that anyone who takes part in a program for de-passivizing themselves and crosses from the side of the merely formed to that of the forming becomes a subject. The whole complex known as ethics comes from the gesture of conversion to ability. Conversion is not the transition from one belief system to another. The original conversion takes place as an exit from the passivist mode of existence, in coincidence with the entrance into the activating mode. It is in the nature of the matter that this activation and the avowal of the practicing life comes to the same thing. These observations allow us to grasp more precisely what Nietzsche had seen when he characterized the Earth as the ascetic planet in his reflections on the genealogy of morals. Ascesis became inescapable from the moment when an avant-garde of observers found themselves compelled to overcome their inner obstacles. More precisely, the 3 obstacles that faced them in the form of passions, habits, and unclear ideas. In view of this compulsion to clarify and practice, this 3-obstacle run that appears at the beginning of higher culture, one can justifiably take Nietzsche's statement further and speak of the Earth as the acrobatic planet. This phrase would also have the advantage of doing even more justice to Nietzsche's most important moral philosophical intuition. In seeking with all his might to free the concept of ascesis from the dismal spectacles of Christian penitential asceticism, and finally brought out the misunderstood and indispensable asceticisms of toughening and advancement among the old elites. He gave the starting signal for strictly artistic interpretation of human facts. If one refrains from the mistaken projection of the Übermensch into the future, it becomes evident what Nietzsche had realized, that since the entrance of peoples into the phase of advanced civilization, every achiever acrobatically comes under tension. Asceticism and acrobatics. Acrobatics is involved whenever the aim is to make the impossible seem simple. It is not enough, therefore, to walk the tightrope and perform the salto mortale at the great height. The acrobat's decisive message lies in the smile with which he bows after the performance. It speaks even more clearly in the nonchalant hand gesture before his exit, the gesture one could take for a greeting to the upper tiers. In reality, it conveys a moral lesson. For our like, that is nothing. Our like, meaning those who have completed the course in impossibility, with making an impression as a subsidiary subject. Some of them remain in the arenas and stadiums until the end of their careers. Others switch to eschateria and climb religious ladders instead. Many retire to the forests and deserts. A further faction tries their hand at the visual and musical arts, and others still speculate on high-ranking civil service, maybe even the highest of all. Plato famously sought to show that the art of governing states can also be learned to perfection, provided the political artistes prepare themselves for the impossible in a 40-year course of study, from the 10th to the 50th year of their lives. The ability to rule the state following ideas and not, as is usually the case, simply stumble around from one situation to the next like a power clown. This too could, with the necessary will, be refined into a masterly performed craft. One does not have to be born as a god, like the pharaoh, to be a practitioner. It is sufficient for an enlightened Greek with the right tuition to practice themselves upwards, psychotechnically, to the pharaonic level. Nietzsche's insights into the convergence of asceticism and artistry show him in step with the tendencies of the late 19th century, which I have described with such key phrases as athletic renaissance and despiritualization of asceticisms. If one has perceived these movements, it is easier to see why ascetic feelings of self-concern certainly do not begin from penitent self-humbling. Early practice systems started from the elementary intuition that one must get to the other side of the three automatisms at all costs. Only thus did man come into the focus of those sequences of exercises which change his nature in order to realize his nature. Here he becomes the animal that is condemned to direct, practice, and think. Philosophical anthropologists have been wont to say since the start of the 20th century, with meaningful emphasis, that humans cannot simply live their lives but must lead them. That is not untrue, and expresses an important insight, though it would have been even more valuable if one could explain why there is no other way, and how it is that countless people, especially in the addiction zones of the West, nonetheless make more of an unleading and unled impression. Anthropotechnics, turning the power of repetition against repetition. The answer is to be found in the emergence of anthropotechnics during the axial age of practice. As soon as one knows that one is possessed by automated programs, affects, habits, notions, it is time for possession-breaking measures. Their principle, as already noted, consists in crossing to the other side of repeated events. Since the discovery of repetition itself as the starting point for its own harnessing, such a crossing has seemed practicable according to precise rules. This discovery was the premiere of anthropotechnic difference. The explanation for this lies in the double-edged nature of the matter itself. With the power of repetition, one simultaneously grasps the dual nature of repetition as repeated repetition and repeating repetition. This highlights the distinction between active and passive in the subject of repetition with pathos. Now one understands. There is not only the affected, but also the affecting affect. Not only practiced, but also practicing habit. Not only imagined, but also imagining notions. Each time the chance lies in the active present participle. In this form, the activated human is celebrated as one who is autonomously feeling, practicing and imagining in opposition to the felt, the practiced and the imagined. In this manner, a subject human gradually sets itself apart from the object human, if it is permissible to use these unsuited, overly modern and cognitively tinged terms here. In the second position, the human stays the same as before, the passive, repeated being overwhelmed without a fight. Whereas in the first it becomes the post-passive, repeating, battle-ready being. Choosing the first path produces the educated human, of whom Goethe still knew that it was formerly a mistreated one. What this human leaves behind on the ascent to education is the naivete that also once belonged to it, together with the twofold attitude towards it: contempt for the overcome cliché and homesickness for the unbroken. The discovery of deep-seated habit has a barely corrigible inertial principle, then invokes the sum of measures that we still feel and continue today as the most far-reaching innovation of the ancient world: the turn towards the art of education, paideia, which initially means something along the lines of the art of the child, or technique for training boys. Children could in fact only come into view methodically as children after the emergence of habits, as those not yet possessed by habits. They attract the attention of the meanwhile lively instructors. In the twilight of the teachers, which is simultaneously an anthropological twilight, the child changes from a mere burgeoning phenomenon to a protagonist in the drama of upbringing. One could say that before this turn towards guidance of boys, children were culturally invisible. Only after the discovery of the region of habit do they gain the privilege of visibility, which can be temporarily diminished, as in medieval Europe, but is never entirely lost. Now the young become object of a concern that develops into a veritable art, the art of controlling habit formations and building up complex competencies on a base of automatized exercises. The advantage of being a child, however, the relatively unformed nature and openness to influence, comes at the price of a natural disadvantage, namely the strong emotionality and spontaneity of the young. The early educators would not have called themselves pedagogues, however, had they not believed that they would cope with this in the long run. Here, behind the educator, one recognised the barely disguised figure of the animal tamer, just as there is grooming behind all teaching. That is why the true history of pedagogy also recounts the shared history of children and animals. But when the animal tamer succeeds in training elephants to walk the tightrope, as Pliny describes in his natural history, or to write Greek and Latin words with their trunks, as mentioned by a different author, the pedagogue should provide more than mere training and enable his pupils to recognise and choose their careers from the multitude of possible ones. Pedagogy as applied mechanics. In short, because the inertial quality of the habitual had been explicitly understood in the twilight of the educators during the first millennium BC, this was naturally followed by the resolution to take control of habit in statu nascendi. Readers note that would mean like in a nascent state, in order to turn the former principle of resistance into a factor of cooperation. This brings us to the underlying principle of all early anthropotechnics. Every technical approach to humans, and that is precisely what pedagogy initially is based on the primal idea from classical mechanics of placing inertial forces in the service of the attempt to overcome inertia. This notion had its first triumph in the discovery of the lever principle. The smaller force can, if multiplied by the longer distance, move the larger force. Similarly, a similar idea also underlies the pulley, which was known in antiquity. Mechany, Greek for cunning, therefore means nothing other than outwitting nature with its own means. Pedagogical mechany grows from the considered decision to use habit for its own negation. One could also say that it uses the probable as a medium for increasing improbability. One divests habit of its resistance qualities and turns it towards the purpose of achieving otherwise unattainable goals. This succeeds if the pedagogue is capable of gaining the greater pull, that is, getting to the root of conditioning through practicing repetitions. From that point, one can say that repetitio est mater studiorum. Small human forces can achieve the impossible if they are multiplied by the longer distance of practice. The discovery of this mechanics triggers the euphoria that shapes the spiritual schools in statu nascendi, in Asia and Europe alike. Hence the high training aims typical of early school and practice systems, as found in the esoteric core of Platonism, as also in most forms of Brahmanic training and Taoist alchemy. Naturally, running a school always involves exotericism and preparation for offices. In the hot core of the teaching, however, is the guidance of adepts towards the vertical wall on which to attempt the ascent to the impossible. Behind the theses of the school's advertising brochure, which states, "Virtue can be learned," lies an esoteric radicalism that can be summarized in the message, "The divine can be learned," which is unutterable on Western soil. How, if the ascent to the gods could be mastered through secure methods, if immortality were just a matter of practice? Whoever believes that also thinks, like Plato, the Indian teachers, and the immortals of Taoism, that they have a mandate to teach the impossible, albeit never beyond a small circle of suitable initiates. The teaching assignment includes the use of all suitable means for overcoming inertia. How far this goes is shown by the long line of spiritual and athletic extremists who have shaped the image of humanity in previous millennia. Didactic ascension, learning for the life of life. Regardless of whether the early school presented itself exoterically or esoterically, however, it never considered itself the goal of its activity. The maxim of medieval schoolmasters, non scholae sed vitae discimus, clearly meant, we are not learning for the base camp, all that counts is the expedition. As straight-laced as this declaration may sound, however, it took on monstrous dimensions in its interpretations. The word, vita, on the first reading, means no more than proving oneself on the outer front, in professions and offices. Everyone involved in the lofty game realised, however, that this was only an initial step. In its deeper design, learning for life was a maxim in favour of the most ambitious projects of ascent. Projects for which the divine was just high enough. Such an equation of God and life was suitable for building up the most excessive vertical tension. It forced people to revise radically their conventional notions of the meaning of life. It suddenly became possible to turn the attribute living into a superlative, and to multiply the noun life by itself. Whoever says life will sooner or later also say life of life. Then, however, learning for life means learning for pure surplus. In the course of studying the heightened life, one encounters the vita vitalis, which stands vertical in relation to the axis of empirical existence. This dictates the direction for the primary surrealism, the vertical pull effective in all advanced civilizations, which was given the unfortunate name metaphysics in the West. Perhaps metabiotics would have been a more suitable term, or on Latin soil the word supravitalistics, though one must admit that both words would have deserved to die of sheer ugliness immediately. The term metaphysics kept itself at the top of our curricula until that other terminological monstrosity, the doctrine of survival, so central for the moderns, gained the upper hand. Dying performance, death on the metaphysical stage. The hardest test for the new subject of the practicing power is death, as it is the factor that forces people most strongly into passivity. Whoever challenges death, then, in order to integrate it into the domain of ability, will, if successful, have proved that it is within the realm of the humanly possible to surmount the insurmountable, or become one with the terrible. That is why all exercises directed against the controlling of the soul by intense affects, unexamined habits, and the illusions of the tribe and the forum lead ultimately and inevitably to measures against the subjugation of all subjugations, the possession of all possessions, the subordination of humans to the power of death. This can occur in two different ways. Firstly, through an asceticism, which leads to an artificially acquired attitude of being able to die. This is how the philosophical Ars Moriendi was read, whose primal scene is the death of Socrates, the most momentous dying performance in the old European world. And that is what was demonstrated by the Indian ascetics, who went through the art of leaving the body in numerous variations. And this was also demonstrated by the Japanese culture of suicide, seppuku, in which it was always extremely important to part with one's life as soon as there was a danger that it could outlast one's honour. Emancipation from the tyranny of death can also occur through the formulation of a myth that asserts the allegiance of the soul to the kingdom of the living God. In such cases, Egyptian doctrines of the afterlife and Christian Platonism provide the best known examples. The soul's right of return is secured less through supplementary ascetic efforts than by living life with integrity. Since the rise of the surrealisms of advanced civilizations, then, the climate of the ascetic planet has been subject to a constant change, something comparable to global warming through ever-increasing moral emissions. This forces the shift from simply living one's life, in the current of collective habitus, to leading life under the influence of individualizing school powers. This new kind of guidance causes a defamiliarization of existence, to the point where notions about the areas of school and life merge into that bizarre dogma that life itself is nothing more than one great pedagogical project that must be learned like an esoteric school subject. And along with life, the art of ending it in an exemplary fashion. This is why what the Greeks called euthanasia, the art of the beautiful death, forms the secret centre of the acrobatic revolution. It is the rope over an abyss that the practicing learn to cross in order to advance from life to meta-life. Along with the death of Socrates, as described by Plato, the old European tradition has a second thanatologically momentous primal scene, in which the emancipation of the intellectually practicing from the tyranny of death could be observed at the greatest height. The death of Jesus as described in the Gospels. In both passion stories, the emphasis is on the conversion of obligation into ability. An ability that transpires all the more impressively because circumstances impose a twofold passivity on the victims. Firstly, in the face of the injustice of the death sentence, and secondly, in the face of the cruelty of the execution's more Romano. In the case of Socrates, it is particularly clear how the wise man's ability appropriates the external compulsion through the fact that he, condemned rightly in formal terms, but wrongfully in factual terms, adapts the sentence to his own will, and cooperates with the procedures imposed on him, as if he himself were the organizer of the passion play into which he was forced. The superordination of the voluntary over the compulsory is most brilliantly embodied by the allegory of the laws that speak to Socrates in the dialogue Crito. The personified laws tell the condemned man something along these lines. Everything would suggest, dear Socrates, that you liked it here on Athens more than anywhere else. We, the laws, and this city we rule, were clearly enough for you. You never went on travels, as many people do, to become acquainted with other cities and other laws. You praised the fate of existing under our leadership like no other. Even at your trial, you proudly declared that you would rather die than be banished. You had 70 years in which to turn your back on us and this city, but you chose to stay with us. So if you wanted to flee from us now in the face of the execution we have decreed, how could you ever repeat elsewhere what you never tired of saying here, that man must regard virtue and justice more highly than anything else? Do not therefore follow Creton's advice to flee, but rather ours, which is this: stay here and continue your path to its end. Thereupon, the wise man draws the only possible conclusion for him. Quote, "This is the voice I hear murmuring in my ears, like the sounds of flutes in the ears of corobants. That voice prevents me from hearing any other. I will follow the will of the gods." End quote. To what extent is it right for Jesus to say, "It is finished"? The absorption of external compulsion into the protagonist's own will is also staged powerfully in the Golgotha account in the Gospels, and is all the more impressive because an execution in the Roman style is as far as one could imagine from the civilized setting of the Greek art of dying. As far as the subordination of the victim to external acts of compulsion is concerned, the Jesuin passion greatly surpasses that of Socrates. And yet is there that the transformation of obligation into an inalienable ability was demonstrated to greatest consequence. The scene of the final moments on the cross is itself loaded with exemplifying energies by the evangelists. While we are told in Mark 15:37 and Matthew 27:50 that Jesus died with a loud cry after drinking from the vinegared sponge, Luke 23:46 describes the same scene in latently ability-coloured transitional terms. "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Et haec dicens experivit." John 19:30 adds a phrase that belongs fully to the sphere of ability, tetelestai, pardon my lack of Greek, tetelestai, rendered in Latin as consummatum est, meaning "it is finished." As venerable as these translations may be, they scarcely do justice to the spirit of John's edition. For what John, the Greek apostle, undertakes at this point is no less than the athleticization of the Saviour's death, which is why Jesus' last words should be reproduced more in the manner of "made it," or even "mission accomplished," even though such a turn of phrase would go against the conventional Christian view of the Passion. The goal of the operation is unmistakable. Jesus must be transformed from the chance victim of willful Judeo-Roman justice into the fulfiller of a mission dictated by divine providence. And this can only be achieved if his suffering is completely sublated, as something foreseen, determined, and desired. The same word with which Jesus breathes his last breath on the cross, tetelestai, is used by John shortly beforehand to posit the fulfillment or completion of written predictions through the Golgothan documentation. The decisive point is that Jesus himself recognizes the fulfillment of the mission on the cross and considers it completed. Sciens Jesus quia omnia consummata sunt. So his final utterance does indeed contain a scriptural, messianic, athletic statement of achievement. The acrobatic revolution of Christianity does not end with the conquest of death's passivity demonstrated on the cross. The triumph of ability over non-ability takes place between Good Friday evening and Easter morning, the most pathos-laden of all time spans. In this time, the slain Jesus carried out the most unheard-of act, that of acrobanein, into hell. He walked through the underworld on tiptoe. With his resurrection on the third day, anti-gravitation celebrates its greatest victory. It is as if Christ, the first among God's acrobats, had got hold of a vertical rope that opened the way for him and his followers to an absolute vertical, previously closed or only sensed mythically. Through his salto vitale, the risen one breaks open the world form characterized by a belief in the supremacy of the fatal interruption. From this moment on, all life is acrobatic, a dance on the rope of faith which states that life itself is everlasting, and in an irrevocably proclaimed "from now on." Klaus Berger remarks on the Athanasian theology of the evangelist, quote, Staring at death is replaced by integration into the line of those who wander beyond death, for even physical death is exceeded. It is merely an immaterial part in the sequence of things. In the sequence of events. End quote. Death, an immaterial part in the course of things. Humanity had to wait a long time for the chance to hear such frivolities, or should one say, such delirious acquittals from the grip of finitude. As soon as such a doctrine is in the world, the psycho-political ancient regime, the normal depression also known as realism, finds itself in palpable difficulty. The steady continuation of the anti-depressive campaign provokes history. It is subject to the law of the deceleration of the miracle. This results in what Alexander Klug called the immense time need of revolutions. Death athletes. The athleticization of the Christian death struggle hinted at by John reaches one of its climaxes during the persecutions of Christians in southern Gaul, initiated by Marcus Aurelius and continued by his successors, which flared up more heavily again around AD 202 under Severus. At this time, the North African Tertullian wrote his consolatory text, Ad Martyros, a highly rhetorically stylized piece, which implies all the tools of ancient eschatology to make the prisoners in the dungeons of Vienne and Lyon aware of the parallels between their situation and that of soldiers before the battle, and even more that of athletes before the agon. The African reminds his Gaulish brothers and sisters, not without a degree of cynicism, that they should actually count themselves lucky to be sitting in a dungeon and awaiting the execution in the arena, as the outside world is a far worse prison for a true Christian. O blessed, consider yourselves as having transferred from prison to what we may call a place of safety. This robust comforter's expectations of the martyrs have already become sporting, to the point where he expects nothing less than peak performances from his fellow believers. These faith athletes owe it to Christ to provide a great match for their executioners. Quote, you are about to enter a noble contest, bonum agonem, in which the living God, Deus vivus, acts the part of superintendent, agonothetes, and the Holy Spirit is your trainer, Zastakes, a contest whose crown is eternity, whose prize is angelic nature, citizenship, politia, in heaven and glory forever and ever. And so your master, epistates vesta, Jesus Christ, who has anointed you with his Spirit and has brought you to this training ground, scammer, has resolved, before the day of the contest, to take you from a softer way of life to a harsher treatment, ad duriorum tractationem, that your strength may be increased. For athletes too are set apart for more rigid training, disciplina, that they may apply themselves to the building up of their physical strength. They are urged on. They are subjected to torturing toils. They are worn out. Coguntur, cruciantur, fatigantur. And they do this, says the Apostle, to win a perishable crown. We who are about to win an eternal one recognize in the prison our training ground, palaestra, that we may be led forth to the actual contest before the seat of the presiding judge, ad stadium tribunales, well practiced, bene exercitati, in all hardships. End quote. Tertullian continues his reflections by reminding the martyrs that profane humans from heathen peoples have defied death and voluntarily taken the most terrible ordeals upon themselves, like the philosopher Heraclitus, who reportedly covered himself in cow dung and burned to death, or Empedocles, who leapt into the flames of Mount Etna. In certain heathen cities, Tertullian tells them, young men have themselves flogged until they bleed, simply to demonstrate how much they are capable of enduring. If these people pay such a high price for mere glass beads, how much easier it should be for Christians to pay the price for a real pearl. Admittedly, tortured Christians in Roman provincial theatres are anything but the ideal of the philosophical savoir mourir. Even in Tertullian's relentlessly drastic rhetoric, however, one can detect an echo of the agonal ethics. One can detect an echo of the agonal ethics, which states that through ascesis and harshness, sclerotes, towards oneself, even immensely difficult feats can become easy. Cur est quia impossibile. Only the impossible is certain. Tertullian's dauntless pep talk to the morituri of Lyon reveals a logic of Christian acrobatism with a clarity never attained again. It is the goodwill to carry out the strictly absurd, the boundlessly nonsensical, the completely impossible, that makes theology theology. This alone prevents it from gliding back into an ordinary ontology. In the kingdom of God, what appears in being as a discontinuity is pure continuity. If Christ is risen, then the world in which no one can rise from the dead is refuted. If we never see anyone resurrected here, however, we should switch locations and go where that which does not happen here does happen. Being here is good, but being there is better. No self-respecting Christian, according to Tertullian, would appear in the circus arena and present any less than the opposite of what the profane people believe to be possible. Whoever believes must épater la bourgeoisie. In the best fighting mood, the author put the matter in a nutshell in his treatise against the Marcionites on the flesh of Christ. Quote, "The Son of God was crucified. I am not ashamed because men must needs be ashamed of it. And the Son of God died. It is by all means to be believed because it is absurd. And he was buried and rose again. The fact is certain because it is impossible." End quote. This curritum quia impossibile underlies practically everything Europeans have known about vertical matters for the last 2,000 years. In Simone Weil's superbly exaggerated thesis, La vie humaine est impossible, human life is impossible, we still hear a certainty that is also born of impossibility. What we call the truth is the result of the quarrel between gravitation and anti-gravitation. The Holy Spirit invoked in Christians was that of wisdom, which ensured that the extravagance of martyrs was tempered by the memory of horizontal motifs in their lives. In this sense, the Holy Spirit was the first psychiatrist in Europe, and the early Christians its first patients. Its tasks include diffusing religious immune paradoxes, which break open at the moment when the untethered witnesses of faith weaken their physical immunity, because they are overly sure of their transcendent immunity. What happened in the arenas of Roman mass culture, at any rate, was no slave revolt in morality, to recall Nietzsche's problematic theorem once again. It was the outdoing of the gladiators by the martyrs. What took place here was the translation of the physical agonies into athletic insistence on the declaration ego sum Christianos, even if the declarers were thrown to those blonde beasts so loved by the Romans, the lions. Even if one views martyrdom with suspicion, sensing in it the fundamentalist obstinacy of people who have nothing better to do with their lives than throw them away with the gesture of an irrefutable proof, one must admit that the acts of martyrdom in the era of persecution occasionally have some of the spirit of the original Christian acrobatism. In some old accounts of suffering, one can still sense that will to cross over which people had begun to practice in the training camps of the higher life. The will to believe was not yet equated with the will to worldly success, as found in the Puritan varieties of Protestantism and in the most recent metamorphoses of quote-unquote American religion. Its symptom was a boisterous trans-vitalism. Wherever it was able to assert itself, the depressive reality principle, the belief in the supremacy of death, had to accept its worst setback. It was the faith in anti-gravitation that suspended the tragedy and stretched the rope so tautly between two states of life that many formed the daredevil plan of venturing a crossing. Even the fallen tightrope walker from the prologue to Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra profited from the tension between the rope ends on this side and the other side. And although the most recent doctrine states that there is nothing to support life on the shore beyond, one still finds ropes in imminence with sufficient tension to carry the steps of those who cross. It almost looks as though one were walking on nothing but air. They form a support that lacks all qualities of a solid ground, quote, and yet it really is possible to walk on it, end quote. Every step on the rope has to be practiced 10,000 times, and yet every step up there must be taken as if it were the first. Whoever trains for the rope subjects themselves to a paideia that removes the foundation of all ground habits. Walking on the rope means gathering all that has been in the present. Only then can the imperative, you must change your life, be transformed into daily sequences of exercises. Acrobatic existence de-trivializes life by placing repetition in the service of the unrepeatable. It transforms all steps into first steps, because each one could be the last. It knows only one ethical action, the superversion of all circumstances through the conquest of the improbable.